My name is James Kenley. I serve as the Executive Director for the Vail Symposium, and on behalf of Dale Mosier, our Chairman, our Board of Directors, and our small but mighty staff, welcome and thank you for spending your evening with us tonight. The Vail Symposium has been offering thought-provoking, affordable programming to the Vail Valley since 1971. We began as a think tank for the town of Vail, and tonight's program harkens back to that important legacy. We are a nonprofit organization, and ticket sales account for less than 15% of our operating revenue. So donors at every level really matter for our ability to bring our programming to our community. And I'd like to thank a few of the organizations and individuals that make programs like tonight possible. Our presenting sponsors are the Town of Vail and the Frechette Family Foundation. Our event sponsors are Vail Resorts Epic Promise, the Vail Daily, and the Antlers at Vail. Tonight's program is presented in cooperation with our friends at the Vail Valley Partnership. I see several of you out there. And I'd like to extend special thanks to Bobby Lipnick for his leadership on tonight's program. I'd also like to recognize the Arabelle Hotel for supporting tonight and to extend our gratitude to the many Lighthouse members in the audience. Your generous support makes a big impact. Would you please give all of those supporters a round of applause? Our winter series is wrapping up, and we have another big program next Wednesday. Last summer, we developed a new series called Conversations on Controversial Issues. This feels particularly resonant with our mission, and as we paraphrase it internally sometimes, we aim to create more civil conversations around the Thanksgiving table. So far in this series, we've covered the U.S. Supreme Court, immigration. We just covered voting rights. It's all light and fluffy. These are the warm and fuzzy ones. Next week, we're covering culture wars in higher education. So these are things like professors being canceled, speakers being shouted down when they present on campuses, administrations receiving political pressure from state, local governments. So if you have kids, or maybe grandkids headed for higher education, or if you have friends who are professors or who serve on boards of universities, I really hope you'll join us here next Wednesday. The complete listing of our programs and recordings from many of our programs are available for free at vailsymposium.org. Before we begin, please turn your cell phones to silent, or better yet, please turn them off and just enjoy 90 minutes of buzz-free focus on these fine folks. We will run until 7:30, and our panel anticipates fielding lots of easy questions from this audience, so get your softballs ready. Tonight's topic should require no introduction to anyone in our community, but I'm going to provide one anyway. In 2017, the Vail Symposium presented a multi-day workshop called the NIMBY Jamboree, focused on workforce housing in Eagle County. NIMBY, of course, stands for Not in My Backyard. If you're a Vail Daily reader, and I sincerely hope you are, because that's where we market all of our programs, you cannot have missed this topic in recent months and even this week. If we acknowledge maybe climate change as the existential threat of our times, housing is certainly right behind it as the most pressing issue in our community. For business owners and hiring managers, for developers and investors, local government, service industries like hospitality and recreation, and of course, those of us who are lucky enough to call this place home, our ability to navigate this housing crisis matters to each of us, admittedly in different ways. And it's complicated. Enter the Vail Symposium and these wonderful people. Tonight, to help us navigate some of the challenging terrain of this topic and to help us take a solution-oriented posture is our moderator and president of the Vail Valley Partnership, Chris Romer. I told myself I wasn't going to do that. He's joined by our own Director of Housing for the Town of Vail, George Ruther, the Housing Program Manager for the Town of Breckenridge, Lori Best, housing specialist for the town and island of Nantucket, Tucker Holland. And he escaped a nor'easter to be here with us. Please offer them a warm welcome. Now to take us through the YIMBY Jamboree, which is yes in my backyard, it's my pleasure to welcome to the stage Chris Romer.
All right, thank you, James. And on behalf of the partnership, thanks to the symposium as well. It's an honor to participate and be able to bring you guys together to talk about this important topic. And James, being called the president of the Vail Valley Foundation is not the meanest thing that anyone has said to me today. So I appreciate that. It's okay. We only live next door to each other, and we only share a wall in our duplex. It's okay that you don't know who I am or what I do. That's all right. Congratulations on James of being named the relatively new executive director of the Vail, whatever they're called. So, James did brief introductions here, but I would like these guys to share a little bit more about their background and a little bit more, give you a little more depth to their bios before we jump into the program itself. So Tucker, let's start with you, and just share a little bit about who you are and a little bit about your experience in Nantucket.
Thanks, Chris, and it's a real pleasure to be here. I grew up as a seasonal resident going to Nantucket ever since I was 3 years old.
Tucker, will you check and make sure you didn't turn your mic off?
George and Lori are going to check as well.
Yeah, we better check.
Can you hear me now?
You're on mute.
You're on mute. It's green.
Oh, now green.
Now we
Now
can.
There we go.
gotcha.
Okay, I just was saying that I grew up going to Nantucket ever since I was 3 years old as a seasonal resident, and then my parents made a wholesale lifestyle change and moved us there full-time when I started high school. I kind of went off and did a few things, got my MBA, was in the ski and snowboard industry for 15 years, so I feel very at home here. And my wife and I made a decision about 10 years ago to return to Nantucket full-time ourselves. Arriving back there, I got involved with a few nonprofit endeavors, was asked to join a few nonprofit boards, and that led to my being asked to help the town in addressing this very pressing issue. So I have been the housing director for the town of Nantucket for about the last 5 years.
Great. Thank you, Tucker. Lori, how about you? Breckenridge.
Yes,
Share a little bit
hello.
about your background and a little bit about your bio with the group, if you would.
Sure. Thanks for having me. This is great to be here. Yes, I'm just from Breckenridge, not very far away. But I am super fortunate to be able to work on affordable housing. I've worked for the town of Breck for 20 years as managing our program. And it is such a rewarding and challenging and interesting field to work in. I got to Breckenridge. I liked your story. I got to Breckenridge. I lived my entire life on the beach. And I do remember the day I was sitting outside at a patio and I was like, I don't want to live at the beach. I want to live in the mountains. And I had never experienced snow. I had no idea what I was getting into. But, the next week I loaded up my little Chevy Love pickup truck and drove out to Breckenridge, of all places. And it was October, and I've kind of been there ever since. And I don't know what drew me to the mountains and the snow. My first job was actually taking public opinion surveys on the lift going up. I didn't know how to ski, but so I got this really awesome uniform, and I'd take public opinion surveys on the lift right up, and then I would just try to get down the hill somehow. But I've loved it, and I love the opportunity to try to keep our community real, and that's what workforce housing really is all about. So thanks for having me.
That's great. Thanks, Lori. And when you picked Breckenridge, did you know you were picking like the highest elevation of all the mountain communities?
I had heard that, and I don't know why. Well, actually, when I came out here, I picked like 5 places in Colorado that I might settle. And Breckenridge won out, so.
Yeah, in fairness to our friends in Breckenridge, their 3 days of summer are super nice.
They are.
George?
It's only one day, and it's like July 5th, and that's it.
George, how about you?
Sure. In 2018, the Vail Town Council created the first ever housing department for the Vail community, largely in response to the housing crisis that we're facing here in Vail. The mission of our housing department is to help Vail realize its vision to be the premier international mountain resort community, one deed restriction at a time. And as Chris said, I'm George Ruther. I serve as the town's housing director for the community. In my prior life, I have been with the town's organization since 1994, I think is when we first came to the valley, and I've served as the town's community development director for a number of years. But when my wife and I came here back in 1994, we came here for 5 years. We were going to try it out. And here we are almost, 30 years later and still enjoying it. I think the most unfortunate piece, however, for us when I look back at my experience here in the Vail Valley is the way we got into home ownership. I'm not sure is even possible today. We reached out at the time, everybody said, if you're here and you think you're going to stay, buy property. We did everything we could. We lived in the dark and we ate ramen noodles for 8 months straight and didn't do anything to save up a down payment. We got into a small condominium down in Edwards, and I'll never forget, we reached out to the real estate broker and we had a list about this long, like all first-time home buyers, of everything we wanted, and we got about that many things on the list. But it is unfortunate that I fear those opportunities like we had, may not exist the way they did in the past. And since the town created the housing department in 2018, and I've had the great fortune of taking on this role, it's probably been one of the most rewarding portions of my time here in Vail. So thank you for coming tonight.
It's great. Thank you guys all again for being here. We have a whole list of questions we're going to get to, but we're going to lay the groundwork and lay the foundation for this discussion. I think we're going to start with a video here from George talking about some of the workforce housing initiatives in Vail.
When we launched Vail Indeed, it was really all about providing, homes for people in the community. And in reality, it's I think done so much more.
Well, I first heard from George Ruther about this program, and when I first heard about this idea, I thought it was brilliant.
We wanted to be a part of this community here in Vail and not live 40 minutes from where we worked.
The Vail Indeed program is a uniquely designed program that is intended to protect and preserve homes for year-round and seasonal residents here in the town of Vail. The Vail Indeed program was created because we knew early on that the town of Vail was not going to be able to build its way out of this problem, because alarmingly we found that of our residential properties that were lived in, when those properties were sold, about 9.5 times out of 10, those properties didn't sell to another year-round resident, but instead they sold to a part-time resident or second homeowner. So what we were seeing was a loss of community. The Vail Indeed program is unique from other programs and initiatives that the town of Vail has launched in that there are no price appreciation caps within the deed restriction, or income limits, or monthly rental rate limits, or household size requirements. We're looking for resident occupancy. Resident occupancy is really defined by an individual who is working a minimum of 30 hours per week on average at a business within Eagle County. We do not have a price appreciation cap on the resale of a home that is in the program, and that's largely because we're talking about the occupancy of the home, and the occupancy only deed restriction, we believe, helps control the price that a seller can ask for that property, or a long-term renter can request in monthly rental rates.
With my blinds open, I'd look out the window and I'd just pinch myself and think, is this place really mine? I heard about the Vail Indeed program through the housing department, and it just offered so many upsides to buying a home here. It was the help towards a robust down payment.
As we narrowed in on possible houses, we really started to dig into the Indeed program through the website and got a lot of our questions answered there. We were in contact with the Housing Authority and the Community Development Office walking us through the program, and it turned out to be a really very painless process.
By design, the application process for Vail Indeed is very simple. There is an online application that can be found at vailindeed.com. Fill out that application. We usually get back to you within probably 5 to 7 business days with an offer to purchase. Typically, because of the sales process, it's about 30 days from the time that an offer is accepted until the funds actually are transferred.
Buyers will negotiate with the town and figure out exactly what they can get approved for. What they're really looking for is, I can get a pretty good sum of money that can be used towards my down payment and closing costs, and that'll get me in the door on a property.
As interest rates have continued to stay at historically low prices, we've seen a number of existing property owners in the town of Vail decide to refinance their property.
We've certainly seen individuals who will come in and refinance their existing property and use the Vail Indeed program. In most of the circumstances, we don't really require them to pay down their mortgage. They can use that money for whatever they need to. Typically what I'll see is people use it for the home improvement project, getting the home to where they really want it to be, or they'll use it to pay off some other debts or fund a kid's college. Maybe their existing lender won't allow them to place the deed restriction on the property, and so that's where we've been able to step in and help people refinance their existing mortgage.
We have seen local business owners participate in Vail Indeed. Their participation has primarily been either assisting their employees in going out and buying a property using the Vail Indeed program, or actually going out and using Vail Indeed to buy properties so they can then in turn rent that property back to one of their employees.
So we use the Vail Indeed program to augment an employee housing program that we already had and we realized the value of. We had a property that we already owned that we bought back in 2008 for employee housing purposes, and I thought, what if we talked with George and his team about putting an Indeed or a deed restriction on that property, did it on that first property, turned the dollars from that into a purchase of a second property, and then did another Indeed on that second property and actually wound up buying a third property. So all of that for very little cash out of pocket. Most of the Indeed dollars handled most of that. My impression was a great one and really very easy.
While it was never our full understanding when we launched the program that long-term rental investors and property owners would participate in Vail Indeed, we have seen a significant number of long-term property owners participate.
I know of several people who've come in who are looking, they see it as a really good investment opportunity. It's a way for them to get in the door, grow their real estate portfolios, and rent it out to somebody who they know is working, somebody who's local, somebody who's going to continue to pay the rent. I think one of the things for me personally that I love about the Vail Indeed program is it's opening up the doors to people who are just like me, who came into town, didn't want to leave Vail.
It was really Vail Indeed that helped me realize my homeownership dreams. And without their contribution, I would not be where I'm at today.
If you're interested in finding out more about Vail Indeed, go to our website at vailindeed.com. Give us a call. Happy to help you in any way we can.
Great. Thanks for that video, George. You noticed the recorded 2021. That was probably added in the last couple months out of necessity of, this didn't age very well. We've got another video we're going to see from Tucker, and then some information from Lori as well. As they pull up Tucker's video, if you paid especially close attention to that video, you might notice that George is wearing the same shirt today that he was wearing in that video. It's the housing department uniform for the town of Vail. George owns one shirt, so we'll make sure Russ gives you a little raise to afford a bigger wardrobe selection. I think we have our second video ready.
We value our history and the natural beauty that surrounds us, yet the heart of our community lies in its people. It's our friends and neighbors who keep this island running, make it fun, and keep us coming back.
Nantucket has changed since I roamed these halls. Did you know there's now more than 17,000 people living on Nantucket year-round? That's around 1,700 students that need an education, and about 250 educators and support personnel for all those students to teach them things like math and manners. But do we have enough stable and affordable housing for all those students and teachers? 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, our hospital provides critical health care for thousands within the Nantucket community. A community that supports local businesses. Like these people who have to deal with you before you've had your morning coffee. Ugh.
Businesses who employ and serve both seasonal and year-round residents.
Does this look snug?
Can you imagine a Nantucket without the people who keep us safe? Without our resources for wellness and mental health? The organizations that strengthen the community and preserve the legacy of our island's people.
The housing problem on Nantucket is no laughing matter. If you're connected to this island, it's guaranteed you're going to know somebody who's been adversely affected by the lack of housing for our year-round community. These are the people that make Nantucket what it is, and they struggle to find, afford, and hold on to suitable year-round housing. The solution isn't easy, but there is one. We've done a great job at conserving our open space and our history. Now let's put that energy into preserving our greatest asset, our people.
All right, again, good foundational video that outlines the issues in the community. Tucker's going to play the role of Marty McFly tonight. He's going to start playing his guitar, and all the disappearing people are going to not fade away anymore. We'll be able to retain them in our community. Congratulations to those who understood the Back to the Future joke. I'm sorry for those who didn't. It's a great movie, circa 1995. I'm good with 40-year-old pop culture references. Apologies if it didn't take. Lori doesn't have a video, but she has a great slide deck, again, in the same vein, to give an overview of the issues and some of the things they've been working on, and then we're going to jump into the Q&A. Lori.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry They don't have a video. I guess it's a little old school, and I didn't even think about it till I got here, and everybody was playing their videos. So tomorrow I'm going to start working on my video. But I'm going to go through the slides quickly because I do think the most valuable part of this will be the dialogue and the questions. So I'll be moving fairly quickly through these, but I think it is good to have an understanding and a baseline of what we've done. We've done quite a bit. Obviously, in the many years that I've been there. But, first current conditions, we're a small town, kind of just like Vail. We're just about 5,000 permanent residents. Plenty of jobs, 6,400 jobs. Plenty of homes, actually. Just the homes are not the types or price points for the folks that are working in the community. So obviously, the ratio of population to homes is always unique when you're talking about resort community. Of our 7,000 homes, 1,200 are deed restricted, which is really 18% of the inventory, and that's actually pretty good. I've seen communities that are shooting for 5% or 10%, so 18% is actually pretty good. But we've got a couple hundred under construction right now, plus a pipeline of units to bring online. Of the inventory of the stock of what we call deed restricted housing, it's about 50-50 ownership versus rental. And since I've been there, we've just added, slow and steady is how I would describe it, about 45 a year, various strategies. I'll talk a little bit about what we've done that's been particularly effective for us. But despite all of this, we are continuing to lose our locals. They're displaced, and we're losing ground on what we would consider to be our key metrics in terms of how we measure the success of our program. But like any resort community, the community evolves over time. And as the community evolves, the housing policies need to evolve, and just trends change. Things change in resort communities, and we always used to think, well, Aspen, they're the mature resort, and let's just sort of follow them and see what they do, because we were a little bit behind in terms of the evolution of our resort economy, but obviously started booming in the 90s with the Eisenhower Tunnel had been built. We were seeing recreation development and tourism all of a sudden. Huge shock because we were almost a ghost town at one point before the ski area came in. But with that initial boom, there's a lot of optimism, and everybody is super excited to have that kind of economic development. And then it didn't take very long until sometime in the 90s and 2000s when it was like, whoa, what did we ask for? There's a lot of people coming in, and things are changing, and that's when we started seeing our fundamental housing plans starting to be put in place and the public policies that would guide our housing program for a long time. And I do think it does involve considerable public intervention because the market alone would displace the locals. So, the public policies and the plans that got put into place in the early phases were just really critical to our program. Deciding that, we are going to focus development in the core of town. We're going to protect the backdrop. That was our joint upper blue master plan. The vision plan, that we wanted to be a real town. Maintaining that real town feel was super important. More important than becoming a high-end resort community. So deciding what the values of a community were and sort of putting those into policy. Obviously having a revenue stream is pretty helpful. Then COVID came and we had a whole new wave of challenges and stresses on the housing. But recently we've created a 5-year blueprint looking forward, and we have a commitment to add more inventory over the next 5 years, a big commitment from our council and our community. The short-term rental fees and regulations will certainly help a little bit too. I think we all have the same tools. I mean, basically, we can add supply, either the public sector adding supply, building projects. We can try to get the private sector, whether it's employers or the private sector who have to build it because of regulations, or who want to partner and build it. But it's adding supply either through the public sector or through the private sector. It's finding the land, trying to make sure that you've got land so that you're in the driver's seat. And then it's preserving existing units that maybe be historically served your workforce. And this slide kind of shows the percentage of our inventory that was achieved through the various strategies. So the code has resulted in 20% of our inventory. Our annexation policies, which were super important to the town of Breckenridge, because that's how we got a lot of our early neighborhoods, is that there was land just outside the municipal boundaries, and those developers wanted access to public water, public sewer, so they had to go through annexation. We had a really strong annexation policy that resulted in a lot of our neighborhoods being developed early. Land banking has been super critical to the town, so that we're in the driver's seat. We've acquired big chunks of land, and that's where a lot of our housing is going. Working with the private sector, super important to leverage and try to incentivize the private sector. And then preserving our new units. We copied George's housing or Vail and Deed program, but we couldn't call it Vail and Deed over in Breckenridge.
That didn't go over well.
I know. My council wouldn't go for it. We called it Housing Helps. So we have a Housing Helps program, which is just basically the program that Vail invented. No silver bullet, clearly. We are doing new construction, we're doing buy downs, we're doing preservation of existing units through Housing Helps. We're doing paying folks for deed restriction. We're even paying folks to accept a temporary lease if they will change from a short-term rental into a long-term rental. So just a variety of strategies and doing a little bit of all of them. No silver bullet, but just spreading it out there. I think the keys to our accomplishments, clearly, we did involve council, and I think the role of the electeds is interesting. We'll be talking about that later, but we have 2 council members that are assigned to a housing committee. They all want that assignment because it's the most fun committee we have. And we meet, staff meets with them once a month and just goes through housing policies, housing projects, make sure we keep in tune with what the council is thinking. Because basically, council in Breck sets policy, we implement it. And it's up to us to educate them and make sure they have the facts they need to hopefully set good policy. But like I mentioned before, the policies that have been adopted by the council help formulate our plan, clearly building out our neighborhoods, whether it's Wellington neighborhood or Gibson Heights. We have hundreds of units that were built in those neighborhoods early, and those are residents and their voters, and they live in their homes. So we have a lot of support from the community for workforce housing because many of our residents are living in workforce housing, and many of our council members are living in workforce housing, or they have employees who are, so they really get the challenge. The impact fees and the sales tax helped, and then us, initially it was a lot of work with private sectors, but probably starting 2010-ish, the town stepped up our role and actually started acting as developer. We own the land, and we were like, well, we might as well try to develop it ourselves. And so we had several projects that were very successful, both on the for sale and on the rental side of things. So towns stepping into that role, which is not normally a role sometimes associated with a municipality. But our council was like, it's at this point it was hard to incentivize the private sector, and so it was like, we've got the land, let's just move forward with some projects. And we did create a local housing authority to assist with some of the things that housing authorities can do that municipalities can't, but it resulted in hundreds of units that were actually built by the town. Then as we moved into what I consider the middle age of our program, we've been starting now to focus more with some partnerships with the private sector. We've got about 350 apartments coming online right now that are partnerships with the private sector. We put the land on it, under it. Maybe we provided some cash incentive, but got a pipeline of projects. We're definitely out there trying to preserve existing inventory. Council committed to additional staffing and resources. For probably the first 16 years of our program, it was just me. Now we're up to 6 people, which is a significant sort of commitment on the part of the council to staff the program. Then once you get it built, you definitely need to have an arm of your program that's managing and overseeing those units, because it's just not just about getting the units built. We now have a really good 5-year blueprint commitment to add another 1,000 units in the next 5 to 6 years. So about 2/3 of those will be new construction, about 1/3 will be preservation somehow, buy downs, housing helps. Lessons from us, diversity of price point and housing types, hitting the entire spectrum of needs, from the person that just moved to town to the person that really makes decent income, just can't afford to stay in Breckenridge. And so that might be a 4-bedroom single-family home. So we do have workforce housing that is a real diversity of types and price points. Land banking, critical revenue, then obviously balancing it with other important policies. For us, like many other resort communities, we have a super important historic district, and we're going to preserve that historic district. We think that distinguishes us, and people come to Breckenridge for the purpose of enjoying and experiencing that historic district. So you do have to find the right balance so that you're preserving the other priorities of your community. And definitely some days are better than other days when you're working on housing. Despite everything we've done, we are still losing ground on what we would consider our key metrics. So even though we have 1,200 units right now and a commitment to build another 1,000, our resident occupied units, which is important to us, that's the people that live in your community full time, we're down to 29% of our housing stock is resident occupied units. Our goal is 35%. Jobs filled by people that either live in your community or have to in-commute. We would love to have, no more than 53% in commuters filling jobs. We're at 73%. So despite all of the accomplishments, on those key measures, it's difficult. But with the addition of the next 1,000 units, hopefully we'll make up some ground, and hopefully we'll see some of those short-term rentals converted to full-time local housing. Challenges, I think any resort community probably shares these. It's the carry capacity of your community. For us, we're surrounded by national forest. Our infrastructure it's challenging in terms of the basic infrastructure, but we, like everybody else, view housing as basic part of our infrastructure. If you don't have the folks living there, you're not much of a real town. Land costs, competing priorities, housing speculation, just driving the prices up and up and up. And, when housing became more than just a place where people live, when it became an investment, that's when we started to see the value of these properties just skyrocketing and the ability of locals to get into those diminishing. Aging population, obviously people are retiring where they want to retire, and a lot of places where they want to retire are the resort communities that we're fortunate to live in. There's support for workforce housing, just not the construction of workforce housing. So that's kind of what we see. But we're going to stay solution-oriented. This is our 5-year blueprint. We're going to commit $50 million over the next 5-6 years, and we actually think that will spur over $350 million worth of private sector investment. So, every time we put a subsidy into the project, we're just covering the gap. There's a lot of private sector funds going into that project. So I know we're going to talk a little bit later about what we would do if we had a magic wand, but I think Breckwood would be a place where people can live, work, play, and raise a family. So that's the story from across the pass.
That's great. Lori, thank you so much. And again, those are designed to be foundational. Now we're going to jump into some of the questions. And George, we started with your video. We'll start with you on the questions. But before we do that, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that Tucker's video had an incredible quote from their CEO of their Chamber of Commerce. That was pretty cool. Lori's presentation started with the Chamber of Commerce in Breckenridge, and yours doesn't mention us at all, which is fine, but let's figure that out for your next recording, okay? And we'll get you a new shirt. So let's jump in. We'll jump into this here, and George, the question for you, and really for all three of you, but we'll start with George. What are you most proud about in your community with regards to workforce housing efforts?
Sure. When you think back on it, there's so many things to be proud of here in the town of Vail, and especially when you think about time and time again, Vail has proven that anything is possible. And I'm inspired every day by this notion that while the workforce housing problem is a challenging problem, but it is one that I'm confident that we can overcome. As a community, we've overcome lots of things in the community, and we've taken lots of strides. If you think back to the main Vail roundabout, the first roundabouts ever constructed at a interstate interchange in the country, that was a risk. That was a substantial risk, and I believe our agreement with the Federal Highway Administration was, if it doesn't work, you're taking it out. And yet we persevered and we pushed through it. Similarly, on some workforce housing or resident housing opportunities that we've had, just the commitment from our elected officials and community members. For those of you who are aware of the Chamonix Vail townhomes, piece of property the town bought a number of years ago down in West Vail, with always the intention of building a new fire station and then some deed-restricted resident occupied homes on them. But at the time, our former mayor, Rod Slifer, shared something that I take with me every day in these conversations. We got down to the brass tacks talking about the purchasing of that property, and we were apart by about $500,000 in the negotiation of that property. And Rod finally said, you know what, this community isn't going to recall whether or not we spent $500,000 too much on this property. What they're going to remember is whether we chose to act. And I'm very proud of the sense that, in the Vail community and our leadership within this community has taken that kind of philosophy forward when it comes to addressing these types of challenges within the community. So
That's great. George, thank you. And Beth, be sure to thank Rod for us when you go home tonight. Let him know that George referenced that. It's a great example, and I'm going to have a follow-up for all of you guys on this as well, but I want to hear from Tucker next on what you're most proud of in the Nantucket community.
So when I first began this work, I was asked to help the town with this. I said, well, what do we have for resources? And there was $250,000 in the bank. I said, that's not going to get us very far. And they were deep into their budgeting process that year, so there wasn't an opportunity to do a whole lot. But I said, just give me $1 million. Like, do something that says this is a priority for the town. And I remember walking into the public select board meeting, and the first thing that the chair said on this topic was, we might as well vote now. I'm completely against it. So I said, it's awfully difficult to pull a rabbit out of a hat without a hat. And to his credit, he listened, and he turned around and he said, okay, we'll give you the $1 million, but you got to tell us how you're going to spend it first. No problem. That was 6 years ago. Voters since then have supported over $70 million of local funding, and we have an initiative on our town warrant this year for a $6.5 million override, which can be bonded, that could provide another $50 or $100 million toward this solution. So I'm very proud of our community stepping up to the task.
Yeah, it's a great example and a pretty darn good ROI for that town selectman. So, hi James, welcome. Lori, we're going to hear from you on what you're most proud about in your community as our AV tech works on Tucker.
Yeah, I mean, kind of the same thing as I was listening to Tucker and to George. The willingness, it's really two things. The willingness to do something. So often communities just do this planning and planning and planning and planning, and they're just really taking that first step is so hard. So I'm really proud of our community's willingness to assume risk, because housing is risky, and to do that. And in addition, I think, you don't typically think of government as being nimble. You think of it as being very bureaucratic. Our council has said, we want housing, figure it out and do it. And they have not sort of micromanaged. They've just said, get housing done because, like George told me just earlier about the camel, was a committee designing a horse and you end up with a camel. So the fact that they sort of just trust staff and they stay where in their zone in terms of setting policy, and they are like, just figure this out, be as nimble as possible. We're not going to do everything perfect. If I could go back and rewrite some of the original deed restrictions, I'd be there in an instant. So I think it's a little bit of just being willing to do something, to assume risk, and to be as nimble as possible.
I think that's a great example, and it's certainly something to be proud of as well. So thank you for sharing that. And Lori, we're going to stick with you here. What would you say, you shared what you were most proud of in your communities, but what has been your greatest success in workforce housing? What's the greatest success in your community that you would point to? And we'll start with Lori.
I guess there's been so many successes. I mean, obviously, every day that you get to see somebody closing on a property or moving into an apartment, I mean, that's a huge success. Every single one of those is a huge success. I mean, I guess from our perspective, really getting those early neighborhoods through our annexation policies was probably the one that has been most impactful over time. So, that would be, developing that super strong annexation policy back in 2000 and resulted in, the neighborhoods that have they are the heart and soul of our community. They're where our voters live. They are where our employers live. So I guess it would have to be those early policies that led to the annexation in so many neighborhoods.
Yeah, thank you. It's great. For a brief moment there, I thought you were going to give one family. I thought you were going to say the Smiths, when the Smiths moved in. I love the Smiths. But the annexation is a perfectly great example of a good success. Tucker, how about you? What's the greatest success in workforce housing that you've seen in Nantucket?
It's tough to top the individual finally getting a stable, affordable, suitable place to live. The community might point to, in Massachusetts, there's a law that says every municipality must have 10% of its year-round housing stock serve or be affordable. And if you do not have the 10% and you are not making good faith progress to get there, then the state basically says to a developer, you can bypass all local zoning as long as what you create has 25% affordable. And it's called Chapter 40B in Massachusetts. And when I first got involved, immediately recognized this was something that we ought to be paying attention to if we want control over how the housing is developed. And so we have been in a continued period of what the state recognizes as safe harbor, which is that good faith progress over the course of the last 5 years. So we have gone from less than 2% that count toward that 10% requirement to now 6.7% with a light at the end of the tunnel on that part. But that isn't the whole story, as everyone knows.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Chapter 40B in Massachusetts. I'm going to look that up. Not generally a fan of heavy-handed government, but that's one that forces local communities to really take things seriously. So it's really interesting. Thank you for sharing that. George, how about you? What's the greatest success in the Vail community?
Sure. In Vail, I believe it was in 1973, the town adopted its first ever master plan for the community and set the vision for the community. And at the time, identified the 3 most critical issues facing the community in order for a young Vail to be successful long term. And those 3 most critical issues were grow a vibrant and year-round economy, provide adequate parking and transportation and delivery services, and ensure an adequate supply of housing for our seasonal workforce. What do you think are the 3 most critical issues we face today? That's not to say that the town hasn't made progress. It's just to say that those issues have manifested themselves differently up to this point. In Vail, it's easy to point to projects, for example, whether that be the new residences at Main Vail, which are set to be open and available for occupancy in August of this year, or the Chamonix Vail townhomes, or the Vail Indeed program for that matter. But I think the greatest success is not a project or a program or an initiative itself, but an approach, a style that the leadership in this community, and not the formal leadership alone, but the leaders within this community have adopted, which is, I talked earlier about the creation of the town's first ever housing department. Through the creation of that department and the mindset that went into it, we've increased the supply of housing within the community by 52% in 4.5 years. That's almost on par with what we have done in the previous 4 decades. And it's not the housing department that did it, it's the leadership in this notion or this belief that again, no problem is too big for the town to solve. So I think it's the style and the approach, and I'm often asked from all places around the country about our Vail Indeed program and its successes, and what I would tell you the most prominent success with the Vail Indeed program is the willingness to think differently about a problem, innovate, and take some calculated risks. Because when we took that program to the town council for the first time for their consideration, looking at me, everyone nodded their head and said, sounds intriguing, but what I want you to do is I want you to go out, survey all the other communities that are doing this around the country, come back to us in 2 weeks and tell us how it's working. And I've shared, I'm not going to do that. I can't do that, because what I'm asking you to do is something that no one else has done in the country. So I'm asking you to take a risk, because you just never know what the rewards might be. And so again, not a program, but maybe a style and an approach and leadership.
Yeah, the question wasn't about a program. It was the greatest success. So I think that style answer is really good. How about, I'm going to ask a question that I'll ask it in a positive way and then maybe in a more, in a different spin. But the question is, and Tucker, we'll start with you. What do you admire in other communities with regards to workforce housing? What do you admire most in what the communities that are aspirational to you? Put another way, what are you envious of?
You are so kind to give me a softball, Chris. I mean, just what George was speaking about, really. Not letting the perfect get in the way of the good, and taking risk and doing something. You will see a Vail Indeed program in Nantucket in the next 12 months. We're not going to call it Vail Indeed.
Your community might not dislike it as much as Breckenridge.
We were adamant.
We do share a lot of seasonal residents, which we feel very good about. No, I honestly admire what you all have done in taking that risk. I'll add, being Nantucket, we have Martha's Vineyard, our sister island. And every time I get on the phone with Philippe Jordy, who is the executive director of the Community Land Trust on the Vineyard, the Island Housing Trust, it's always, oh man, I wish we were doing more of what you're doing, and they're doing the reverse with us. And so finally, I'm besting Philippe in that we are creating a community land trust on Nantucket.
Great,
nice.
And Philippe generously is serving on our board.
But I think Lori referenced it earlier, that we all have, in a way, the same tools, although George has invented a new one. And it's not reinventing the wheel every time, but doing the type of learning that you all are promoting here.
That's great. So I heard Martha's Vineyard and Vail is 2 that are aspirational to you. Lori, same question for you. What do you admire most in other communities with regards to workforce housing? And again, put another way, what are you most envious of? And if you have an example of a community or 2, I think that would be great.
Well, we are always looking and checking in with our peer communities to see what they're doing, what's going on, what's working. I think this week I'm most envious of Steamboat because of their charitable donations that they've been receiving. The land, I think the latest donation that the Housing Authority over there received was in the hundreds of acres. So I'm super envious of that right now. But every time I go to a conference or I have the opportunity to meet up with housing folks from all over, I learn another thing that people are doing, and just envious of the innovation. I mean, we need to be innovative, but I need to start a charitable donation solicitation program.
Yeah, it's the same in every industry, right? You go to a conference and you implement R&D. Yeah. Rip off and duplicate.
Exactly.
Right?
Rip off
so
and duplicate.
It's good. Steamboat, and we'll circle back to that in our next question. But George, I want to hear from you. Who are you? What do you admire in other communities, and what are you most envious of?
Sure. What I think I admire most about other communities are that are taking in identifying real solutions to the housing problems is their progressive policies that they're adopting around some of these housing solutions, whether it be around short-term rentals and mitigating against the impacts that short-term rentals can have on a community, or coming up with creative solutions for mobility and transportation around the community, so that we can spend more of our time focusing on providing homes for people versus parking spaces for cars. Or in the case of Cambridge, Massachusetts. Cambridge, Massachusetts, I think did something that was absolutely brilliant and pushed back against the NIMBYism that was occurring within their community when they attempted to adopt a community housing plan that really turned into not a plan to identify where homes could be built for resident housing, within affordable homes could be built in the community, but instead it turned into a plan. It was turning into a plan where homes could not be built. And the leadership in Cambridge, Massachusetts said, we're done with this. This is an important segment of our community. We need to think about it differently. And they adopted a master plan that takes their municipal boundaries and says affordable housing is allowed anywhere inside these four walls of this community. And then they adopted progressive and more efficient and effective development review processes and land use regulations that aligned with that goal to achieve those results. So I admire that type of thinking that went into that creation. And we're talking about this being the YIMBY Jamboree. I think they may have created the ultimate way of saying yes in my backyard.
Yeah, no, that's great. Great examples and good things for people to take back and study things that are happening in those communities. Lori, and we'll start with you because you brought up Steamboat. And Steamboat, for those who don't know, has a big parcel that was donated, anonymous donor, tens of millions of dollars worth of land, and yet they're having a heck of a time getting anything done because there are very vocal people in their community fighting every step of the way against workforce housing being built because they don't want more people in Steamboat, they don't want businesses to grow in Steamboat. They are doing everything they can to prevent the development of the Brown Ranch area in Steamboat, which was donated and subsidized specifically for workforce housing. So it's an admirable aspect, but it also there's significant roadblocks. Even when you have the land, even when you have the money, there is, and if you study what's happening in Steamboat, it's going to be fascinating to see how it plays out, because there's a very real question of if that land will ever be developed for workforce housing. They have a huge, they're at a confluence, right? So the question for you guys, and Lori, we'll start with you. What are the major roadblocks to workforce housing in your community? And if you had that magic wand, what would you do to fix it?
I definitely know the roadblocks. I don't know if I know the solutions, but
you have a magic wand.
I think
you can fix it.
For us, I think obviously it's land first. Is being able to acquire the land so that you can be in the driver's seat. And then it's just figuring out how to balance the competing priorities, because every community is going to decide where they fall in terms of what are their most important priorities. And every community is slightly different. So for us, historic preservation and making sure that we preserve that historic character of our town, super important, and obviously that's a roadblock, because that's in the core of town was traditionally where you would want to have your workforce living so they can walk to work, all sorts of things. So for us, having a historic district that is super important, and to tell you the truth, I wouldn't change a thing. I agree that needs to be preserved. It's that important. So it's not housing at all costs, but it's trying to find the balance. And every conference that I go to, and I talk to other housing folks, and it's what you would expect to be the competing priorities. It's open space, it's view corridors, it's just density and small town character. Those are the greatest challenges and barriers to workforce housing, is small town character. We want to stay small. That's what makes us unique. We don't want to be Denver. So for me, it's density, it's small town character is clearly the most challenging bit.
Yeah. Tucker, let's hear from you. What are the most major roadblocks to workforce housing in Nantucket? And if you had your magic wand, what would you do to solve them?
It's correct, Chris, that the honorarium for being here is leaving with the magic wand.
It is.
Right? Okay, good.
Yeah.
We can't wait to get ours.
You get a black vest for being on the panel, and you get a magic wand.
Already have that.
Yeah, we've already got the vest. So I talked a little bit earlier about the community being very supportive of funding the housing effort on Nantucket. And while they have gotten behind $70 million of local funding, we have a $500 million problem. So if I had a magic wand, I'd like to bring it with me next Thursday, when roughly 250 people from the Vineyard in Nantucket will be on the State House steps in Boston advocating for a transfer fee for housing. We have one already on Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard for conservation. 53% of our island is in conservation hands today, but we have proposed one 0.5% on amounts over $2 million in real estate transactions in order to fund our housing efforts. I was asked to meet with the governor when we first introduced this 6 years ago. It probably took him about 20 seconds to say, this is a rounding error. $5,000 in a $3 million transaction. And I said, exactly, but in Nantucket, it adds up. And had we had it in place last year, it would have generated over $6 million. And again, those are funds that can be bonded with. So we've been pushing to get this for the last 6 years. We have a new governor and lieutenant governor who are on the record of being in support of this type of local measure. It's completely optional to the local municipality. And so if we could get that passed, that's how I would use the magic
That sounds
wand.
like a magic wand to me.
It is.
So I don't know that you need to bring one home from Colorado.
Leave it here.
No, it's a great example, and being able to bond that money helps to really make it impactful and help address the issue. So a great example. Thank you for sharing that. George, how about you? Major roadblocks to workforce housing and your magic wand to solve them.
Sure. I think, if you think about the topography of the Vail Valley, we're a community surrounded by U.S. Forest Service property, much of it wilderness area. And I had an opportunity late last summer to travel to Cape Cod, and and a woman in the audience reached out and during her presentation and asked, what does Vail have in common with Cape Cod? And my response was, what we have in common is we both may as well be islands. You are actually an island surrounded by water. We're an inland island surrounded by undevelopable Forest Service land that we cannot build on. So the ability to have developable land is a real challenge here in the Vail community. Unfortunately, what I share all the time in the office is I think one of the greatest challenges is all the good land's gone. All the stuff that we're now trying to build the most affordable homes on, it costs us some of the most money in order to construct on. So developable land is a challenge. The ever-present gap when it comes to financing these projects, in my experience, there's no such thing as a free deed restriction. No one has ever showed up at my office and said, here's a free deed restriction, take one, it's yours, enjoy it. It all comes at a cost, and we need to figure out a way to finance those. On top of that, Home Depot doesn't sell deed restricted 2x4s. There's 2x4 costs what a 2x4 costs. So when we're talking about developing, these developments for our local workforce and residents, the cost is the same whether it's free market or deed restricted or otherwise. So overcoming that gap, and then there's always that the headwinds that are created and that we face by a sometimes very small but very vocal minority in our community that believes housing is a good idea anywhere but here. And I think that is something we really need to sit back and think about when we talk about creating, maintaining, and sustaining community. As an example of maybe, if I had a magic wand, and it's not really that much of a magic wand, as much as an example that we've already accomplished here within the Vail community, and that was the Lions Head Redevelopment Master Plan. If you think back on that and have any thoughts or knowledge on that, we had a master plan. We had 55 acres of our community that was in desperate need of redevelopment. In fact, in order to get that redevelopment funded, we had to make a finding that the area was blighted. We had to go out and say that, a commercial core within Vail, Colorado is blighted. And our blight was, avocado appliances and shag carpeting in these old, outdated residential homes. But the Lions Head Redevelopment Master Plan, what it really did, I think, and if I had a magic wand, we'd repeat it for housing. We do the exact same thing with the housing problems that we face as we did in addressing Lions Head. And that is, we brought the community together. We coalesced and collaborated around a common goal. We clearly and concisely identified what the problem was. We identified tangible and successful solutions, to that problem. We added residential density as a form of helping fund the redevelopment of that area. We granted a 30% increase in density bonus so that the private landowners could afford to redevelop their property. Think about what a 30% increase in density could do if we could do that for affordable housing within the community. We created a purpose-driven zone district. We said, within this area, these things are going to happen. And much like Cambridge, Massachusetts, they said, we're going to create a purpose-driven community, and affordable housing is going to be something that we accept within the community. We showed how partnerships with the private sector could be successful. If you think back to Vail's Renaissance, that included the Lions Head redevelopment. There was one time in that redevelopment process where we looked at kind of internally, the town had made a $27 million investment into that redevelopment process. The private sector, however, had made a $2.5 billion investment into that process. We can do the same things with housing that we did in fixing the resort side of our resort community as we can to fix the community side of our resort community.
Yeah, good. Thank you, George. And thanks each of you for that. I'm going to use a little bit of executive privilege. I have some other questions, but I want to give you my magic wand. What I want to do is reverse engineer Massachusetts Chapter 40B that allows developers, if allows developers to do 25% if a community isn't reaching thresholds, and allow developers to bypass the process, which is 2 to 3 years and $2 to $3 million with no certainty, if they meet certain thresholds. They get to bypass it if they meet certain thresholds. So that's my magic wand. we'll see if we can develop some policies for our local government and push them. You use 25% in Massachusetts, I would say 40 to 50%. If a project has 40, 50%, meets LEED's environmental standards, meets parking things that are all agreed upon, then you take the vocal minority out of the picture because you get your elected officials to say, we support housing, here's the policy. Then the developer can say, we have the land. We're going to do it because you already approved all of it, and the people who pretend that they love housing have to actually love housing. So that would be my magic wand. I appreciate the ability to do that. And James has a microphone. I want to leave time. I'm cognizant of the time. We have about 15 minutes left. I want to leave time for Q&A. If you guys don't have any questions for these guys, I have other questions, but want to make sure we leave some time for you guys. So I think James is going to run, right?
I'd say the odds of no questions in this audience is low. A couple quick things, etiquette-wise. When I give you this microphone, please speak into the microphone and not in some general direction of the microphone, because it doesn't work. Also, please stand if you are able, and given the time constraint and the topic, please limit your context and find your question as quickly as you can. And with that, who's going to start us off? That was the first hand I saw. Here we go.
Yes, my question is directed to George in particular, but I must make a comment that all three of you have the great fortune of being in communities that make a lot of money and have a huge tax base. Now, with my question to George, if we look at Vail and we look at the price of land and we consider scaling up affordable housing, there is no backyard in Vail because there is no land. So my question to you is, what has the Vail Housing Authority done to reach out to the communities all over this valley to develop a comprehensive long-range plan for a community of up to 5,000 people, with each community contributing to that effort?
Sure, great question. And you know, I think when it comes to addressing the housing problem, there's opportunities to address. There still are some opportunities here within the town of Vail, but there's no doubt there's other opportunities west of Dow Junction in Down Valley. And right now, about as much time as I spend exploring opportunities here within the community, we are looking at Down Valley opportunities. We'll be looking very recently with, Kim Williams is here from Eagle County's housing department, and Kim and I and the others, the folks from the Avon Community Development and Housing Department are here as well. We'll all be sitting down to collaborate in a conversation around a 40-acre parcel of ground in Eagle Vale that has an opportunity to not only provide some affordable and attainable housing within the community, but actually make a real dent. We talk about some of these developments, these 8 and 5 and 10 unit developments, and we pat ourselves on the back. To be successful, we need another 3 or 4 Miller Ranch types of communities within the county. So we're reaching out, the Vail Town Council for the first time, actually appropriated funds, taxpayer funds, to be spent outside the 4 walls of the town of Vail on Down Valley housing opportunities, which, that is something typically communities do not do. Sales tax collected at home are spent at home. In this case, the town council actually allocated some dollars when we could demonstrate a direct value back to the town of Vail to make that investment in housing Down Valley. So I would keep looking for those opportunities, because to your point, we're running out of developable land areas here in the town of Vail, and we need to collaborate better with our partners down Valley.
All right, so I'll start this by saying I lead for YIMBY Denver, one of the largest YIMBY groups in the country right now. Is that close? I'm sorry. And one thing I want to say is YIMBYs, when we talk about YIMBYs, one thing we really like to talk about is zoning. Zoning, we believe, has constricted supply, and it's the fundamental cause of the housing shortage, not just in places like Vail, but across the entire country. So going back to the idea of this magic wand, if you had a magic wand to change zoning laws in resort towns, how would you change them to help increase supply of affordable housing and housing in general?
I love it. Tucker, you want to take that one? I'm going to pick on the guy from out of town on the tough question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chris. Well, it's interesting. So in Nantucket, we have checked a number of the best practice boxes on zoning as far as the state is concerned. Like, just to give a little bit of context, so at present, in a community where there are 17,000 year-round residents, there are a grand total of 53 residential listings on the market with an average listing price of $6.2 million. Last year, the average sales price was $4 million. The median sales price was $3 million. In today's interest rate environment, you have to be earning $591,000 a year, plus have $600,000 in the bank to afford the median home. So zoning is not going to get it done in Nantucket. There always is room for incremental improvement, but we've taken a lot of steps and have a lot of incentivized zoning policies to create housing, but the market isn't getting there yet. So you have to have subsidy in a place like Nantucket.
Lori, the zoning question for you?
Yeah, I kind of agree. You know, when we have somebody that wants to develop a workforce housing project at a higher density, we don't have the traditional Euclidean zoning where it's, you know, 1 unit per acre or whatever. We have an expedited process for anybody that wants to develop workforce housing, and basically we will evaluate that site, and it's not really an upzoning, but we will provide additional density for that site based on that particular site and what it can accommodate, where it is, how many units are realistic in terms of being able to be accommodated on that site. So we deal with that by providing the additional density on a sort of site-specific basis once we've analyzed that site.
George?
Sure. I'll take a slightly different response to the zoning question. I think, you know, zoning is a byproduct of a number of things within the land planning and land development world. But also with zoning comes the notion of a development review process. There's some review that goes along with it. I think as much as the talk out in the world today is about, you know, eliminating single-family zoning and changing some of the approaches to zoning in communities, I think the real opportunity is addressing our review processes. You know, one of the greatest barriers I see from the public sector is the amount of risk that is involved in the development review process itself. I think Chris may have alluded to, you know, 2 to 3 years of time putting money at risk with no guarantees. You know, about the only thing a developer knows has a guarantee with a development application is when it gets submitted. After that, it's out of their control and it's into the hands of someone else. And while the process is important, I think there is a way to build a better mousetrap around our development review processes so that it focuses more on getting to yes, not always yes, or getting to no quickly. You know, that's just as important. But, you know, the zoning piece or the land use regulation piece, and it's come up a couple times here, but Vail, like Breckenridge and Nantucket and Aspen and Park City and Jackson and you name the communities, we all have commercial linkage, we all have inclusionary zoning requirements, and what do we all have? Housing problems. So what I would suggest to you is relying upon those types of tools to accomplish or address our house it's the wrong place to start. That we need to look elsewhere to more innovative solutions to address the problem than regulatory zoning.
Laura, can you expand on 2 statements that you made? You stated that government should be more nimble, and there's not also we need to stay away from the housing at all costs. Can you just expand on that and provide a little more detail or a specific example? I think the NIMBY piece is what George was just getting at in his last statement, but if you meant something different.
No, I think, in terms of, well, it sort of goes to the entitlement process too. I mean, just, having so many unknowns and getting to yes or no quicker is super important. And changing course of action. If situations change, I think Breckenridge at least has been able to be fairly nimble in reacting. That policy isn't working right now, move over to this strategy. Developers aren't coming to us asking for opportunities to build workforce housing. Shift to something else that is more effective based on whatever the trends are that are going on. But the world changes quickly, and I think, typically government doesn't. And, I think we learned a lot during COVID about how many trends are out there that are challenging for local small towns, and how we have to be really nimble and not just be set in, this is the way we're going to do it, and we're going to keep doing this until it works. No, I mean, we're quick to move to a different strategy based on what's going on in the world and in the market and market conditions, obviously. But I think that was the answer to the NIMBY question. Yeah.
This question is for George. Real estate's a capital-intensive undertaking. What do you think the most viable mechanism is to raise money? Because if the town has got to subsidize and promote development because the projects don't pencil, where are we most likely to get money so that we can help move this along? And my second question is there any chance of a regional housing authority? Or do the other parts of the county have their little fiefdoms in mind and they don't want to cooperate?
Well, I'll start with the second question first, because that's the easiest one. I do believe there is great opportunity for more regional approaches and collaboration around addressing the housing problem, especially with the most recent passage of the Regional Transportation Authority. So much of the housing challenge is, especially if you're talking about outside of a community, whether it's Vail or Avon or Eagle or Edwards, is mobility and transportation and getting people from their homes to the places they need to be. So I think that the second part of the question is easiest. The question about real estate development in the cost of development, in the amount of financial gap that often exists, that's something where I think we can become. There's funding sources out there. There's state and federal funds that are available. The threshold or the bar to achieve some of those funding opportunities is challenging at best, but those funds themselves are very much limited. I think where the opportunity really lies is a conversation we're having right now about the Timber Ridge redevelopment and an opportunity that exists there. We need to look to the private sector, because the private sector will step in just like they did in Lion's Head and help us solve a community-wide problem. They'll bring that capital and equity to the table to help solve the problem. We just need to create an environment in which they can be successful. The thought that our housing problem is going to be solved by, one, building our way out of it isn't the answer. We've talked a little bit about that tonight. But then the second piece is, if there's a belief that the government, local, state, federal, or otherwise, is going to constantly have an adequate supply of money to fund the financial gap, where it's a non-starter. So we need to look to, Timber Ridge. We're looking to the business community to partner with the town of Vail on the development of that property, and identifying where we have common ground in shared alignment. So I think those opportunities exist, but capital is always going to be a challenge to getting these projects built, because like I just shared, there's no such thing as a free deed restriction or a deed restricted 2x4 in funding those gaps. Steamboat, we talked about Steamboat. In other communities, Lake Tahoe in Truckee, California, have seen a fair amount of impact investing from community members within their community, that understanding that it may not be the highest return on their money, but it is a low-risk investment that they can make, and they can also be making an impact on the community when they make those investments to help fund these Brown Ranch type of developments within the community.
Can we pass a tax? Is there any viability
In
fundraising?
Yeah, in what was it, in November of 21, we did pass that tax.
22, last year.
22.
Yeah.
That sales tax was passed in the town of Vail, 1.5% percent increase.
21 for Vail, 22 for unincorporated Eagle County.
Right.
And gypsum.
But yeah, those opportunities exist. But again, and I think Tucker was talking about a transfer tax. We have a transfer tax here in the town of Vail. Our transfer tax is earmarked and dedicated towards other funds. What was always interesting to me, though, was if you follow the history of the adoption of the town's real estate transfer tax, it failed to pass until using the funds for community housing was removed from the ordinance. Once it was removed, it passed. Not to say that open space and recreation and those things that it's funding are not important, but imagine where we might be today if some of those funds had been available across a wider spectrum. Because as much as the value of open space, we could have done some things with housing as well. Not on open space, but just to address some of these issues we're facing.
We got our next question.
I guess last but not least, with a regional housing authority, isn't one of the solutions which has worked elsewhere to go more vertical, to go 5, 7, maybe 10 stories somewhere with a shortage of land?
Yes.
Yes.
But expand, guys, please.
Yeah, I would add, that's exactly what we did with the Lions Head redevelopment master plan. We allowed for additional height to accommodate that 30% increase in density to pay for the redevelopment of everything that was beneath it. And if land is your scarce commodity, one of the more effective tools or practices you can take is to have a better and more efficient use of that land, and sometimes going vertical. And what I like to share is, density done right. Not density for density purposes, but density done right can be a solution to some of these lack of land availability issues we face.
And I'm seeing head nods from you guys, and I'm cognizant of the time. I would challenge you to think about that in terms of, if you look at Pitkin Creek Park, if that was 1 story higher, would it impact the livability in East Vail or the community in East Vail? Probably to the positive. If Riverwalk in Edwards was 1 story higher, if any of these examples that you would look at were 1 story higher, would it negatively impact the community, or would it be additive? And the answer is it would be additive, right? So your question, I glibly said yes, but I was serious. And then George gave you the politician answer with all the narrative behind it. So thank you, George. And so we are at 7:30. We are at our time today. Thank you to our panelists. Round of applause for these guys, if we could.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And a big thank you to the Vail Symposium and to the team at the Vail Valley Partnership for helping put this together. And as usual, thank you to all of you for taking the time out of your schedules and taking the time out of your evening to join us here today. So a round of applause for you guys as well. Be sure to check the symposium website and the partnership websites for upcoming programs and events and opportunities to engage. And thanks again. And thanks to James and the team.
Thank you. Thanks.